Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the One of the Many video cast with Rob Guzman. How you doing? I'm doing well. So here I am after a brief hiatus of no videos, once again doing videos on commentary for those of you who want to hear my analysis and provide a breakdown of what's going on in the world philosophically speaking. As you can see, I've got some new digs. I moved recently, so here I am in my new apartment building. They have a really nice library, get some good books. So, great place to shoot, some variety in the background. So I figure, why not? Let's give it a try. So today, I want to talk about one issue to warm us back up and get us back to a cadence where we're familiar with what goes on in the show. So the issue I want to cover is a pretty big one, and it's only one really big headline that's been in the news recently. And that is the issue of the so-called Yellow Vest protests in France. So those of you who don't know about this is a few weeks old now. As far as I can tell, there haven't really been in the media for the last couple of days since this last weekend. But the Yellow Vests were a group of people in France who were protesting a fuel tax put on by the president of that country, Emmanuel Macron. Now, the Yellow Vests get their name from the fact that they basically, as motorists in France, are required to hold these vests in their car at all times in the event of an emergency. So if they're ever off at the side of the road, people can see them when cars are coming. It's actually a great example of French statism. That is, France basically passing laws for the better of their citizens, forcing them to act in their own interest, this kind of thing, or in their perceived interest. So the Yellow Vests, who are they and what have they been up to? Well, they're upset about this fuel tax. A lot of them are motorists, and a lot of them are sort of middle-class people. And it began as kind of a grassroots, nonviolent protest, but it's gotten pretty violent in the days since it started. These people have flipped over cars, set fire to buildings. I think over 200 of them were arrested in Paris in one day alone, and about 1,500 were converging on the presidential building, threatening Macron and others. So this is pretty bad from a optics perspective, but it's also bad just in terms of the stability of France. I mean, France, if you know the history of France, they go through republics like, we go through clothes, right? They're very quick to change their government. They've been through, I think, 5 or 6 different republics in their history for various reasons. And maybe they're due for a change. But this is less about France in particular, and I just want to talk about the philosophy that's animating these Yellow Vests. So the Yellow Vests are not advocates for capitalism. They're not advocates for freedom. They're not advocates for capitalism or freedom. What they want is higher taxes imposed on people who are not them. So they want higher wealth taxes on the rich. They want more minimum wage. They want more protectionism. They want more government, just not on them, on their back, on someone else's back. They are calling for Macron to resign, and they're backed, oddly, or I guess predictably, by the communists and the socialists in France, who are basically leading the charge to get Macron thrown out of office. So we'll keep an eye on this. I think as far as France goes, they're kind of a bellwether for what's happening in Western Europe. So we should keep an eye on that. But the reason I bring this issue up, and the reason I want to talk about this one in particular, and why I'm going to dedicate the rest of the show to this incident, is it touches on an important issue, which is the issue of climate change and environmentalism generally. So I haven't really addressed this issue explicitly on my show, and I kind of want to do that now. And I figure it's a big topic. There's a lot of dimensions to cover. So I figure rather than spread it out, let's just do it in one big shot. So I'm going to give you my take on this issue and what I think about it. And I think it's important that we all, just kind of discuss this philosophically, scientifically, and come to an understanding of what's going on here. So climate change. So for one thing, there's kind of a split in our country, and it's along political lines on this issue. This is nominally a scientific issue, the issue of whether or not the Earth is warming or not. And yet, we see people splitting along political lines on this issue. Why is that? Well, there are generally three claims raised by warming advocates. We'll call them that, for lack of a better term. Basically, they argue that human action is causing the Earth, the climate specifically, to change. And then usually they mean we're adding more CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, and CO2, being what's called a greenhouse gas, insulates the planet so that solar radiation that's coming in can't escape. And this raises the temperature, causing the ice caps to warm. And, one effect is the sea levels rise, less land becomes habitable, so on and so forth. So that's one claim by the warmists, is that this is happening. Scientifically, it's happening. Two, they argue that man is to blame for it, that basically it's human activity, specifically the burning of fossil fuels, that are to blame. And three, the third big claim, is that we need to do something about it. And how are we going to do something about it? Well, government. The big G word. It's always the answer to this problem. They say, well, we can't have industry do it because industry caused it. So we need government to come in and police it because no other entity is capable of doing it. And if we can make it so that all the governments in the world cooperate, maybe the UN should be at the helm of this thing, who knows? But someone's got to do it, and it's got to be done by force. It's got to be done with government, which is what they mean whenever they say they want government to do it. They mean they want it done by force. So that's basically the three issues. Now, I will start by saying I am not a climate scientist. Okay? I don't have a degree in climatology, but I will also point out that I think most of the people who argue for this issue that I speak to also are not climate scientists. You don't have to be a climate scientist to have an opinion on this and to know something about it and know something about how to assess evidence. So I think that's the first thing I like to talk about here is who speaks for science. This is an issue that comes up time and time again depending on the issue. It could be today climate change, yesterday it may have been evolution versus creationism, or is radiation a problem? What about GMOs? What about vaccines? All these things are scientific questions. The issue is who speaks for it, and how do we determine what is true and what is false if we are not experts in the field? Now, this is an epistemological and philosophical question that we have to discuss. And the question is, how do we know that something is scientifically true, scientifically valid? So I want to start by rejecting a view that a lot of people who are warming advocates seem to believe, a view that they seem to believe, and that is that science is whatever scientists say. That the scientific consensus comes to a conclusion, and that is science. That is not science. That's an argument from authority is what that is. Now, they'll come back with that and say, well, it's not just a mere argument from authority. They have credentials. They have degrees. They have research. They have studies. Well, first of all, we know nothing about their studies or the rigor of their experiments. We don't know how true to the scientific method they were being. They may have been peer-reviewed, and that does raise the caliber of the work, but you have to remember that the scientific community has been wrong in the past and will be wrong in the future on big issues. All you have to do is remember the story of Galileo or Copernicus to know that, or any great scientific innovator. I mean, before Newton, before Einstein, before all the major scientists discovered their theories, they were not part of the scientific canon. And so they were at odds with the scientific community, and yet they were correct. So it's not enough to just say that you have the backing of scientists. It's not enough to say that, it's not enough to say that just because you have some letters after your name, because you got a PhD, or because you have a master's, or because you've done a lot of work in the lab, that makes you now immutable from criticism and a scientist and capable of ruling on these things, and others aren't. That's not how science works. Science is an objective methodology. More than anything else, but more than the content and more than the experiments themselves, science is a methodology to arrive at truth. It's how we test facts. It's basically the idea of the scientific method, where you basically start with observations, okay? And those observations lead you to form a hypothesis, okay, or a tentative view on things. And then once you have a hypothesis, you can now subject it to what are called controlled scientific studies, where you isolate variables and you try to measure what a change in one variable will do to the system as a whole, while keeping other things as a control, while keeping other specimens as a control. And it can be very difficult sometimes to do this effectively, to isolate all the different factors, but to be truly scientific, that's what you need to do, is to isolate it. And so ultimately what science is about is cause and effect. It's finding and identifying cause and effect relationships in nature. Now, philosophy does not rule on science per se. Like, I can't, from the armchair, and I'm in an armchair here, I can't, as a philosopher, right, or as a theoretician, come out and say, well, philosophy says that climate change is false. That's not how philosophy works, and you would never reach a scientific conclusion based on philosophical principles. But what philosophy does do is it basically forms the rules or the constraints that bound the other sciences. So let me explain this point a little bit. In philosophy, we talk about the different branches of philosophy. So there is metaphysics, which is concerned with reality as such. It's what is reality, what are its properties, and, is it real? Is there one reality? Is there two realities, etc.? Epistemology is the branch of knowledge, of study of human knowledge. It's how do we know? How do we know what we know? Can we know anything? Is certainty possible, etc.? What are the standards for evidence? Can you trust your senses, etc.? And then finally we reach ethics, which is, how do you live a good life? How do you achieve happiness? What should be your goal, as a living entity? And then finally politics is, how do you arrange society? How do you make it so people can live with one another and achieve their values without infringing on one another's lives? So broadly speaking, that's what philosophy studies. Now, in metaphysics, the study of reality, basically, my philosophy holds there are three basic principles that come before any scientific inquiry. And in fact, all of scientific inquiry is based on these three principles. Those principles are that something exists, that is, existence exists. There is something, not nothing. Okay, that's point one. Pretty simple, right? Point two, consciousness exists. That is, we exist as conscious entities. We perceive reality, and our very act of perceiving it means that we are capable of perception, so therefore consciousness is real, it exists. And three is that A is A. Things are what they are, they do what they do. They are what they are and not what they are not, and there's no nothing. There's no vacuum, there's no emptiness. There is something, there is no nothing, and the things that are what they are. Okay? Now, from that, you can get the idea of cause and effect, which is basically the law of identity applied to entities, right? So things have a certain nature, they act a certain way, and that's cause and effect. Now, that's all philosophy says on this issue. Now, the specialized sciences take over and they study the existence themselves. They study, chemistry studies, matter. Biology studies living systems. Medicine studies the human body. Psychology studies the human mind. Zoology studies animals, and so on and so forth. These are all specialized sciences, but look at what they all take for granted. They take for granted cause and effect. They take for granted that your senses are valid. They take for granted that you are perceiving your experiments and your results. And they assume that there is a reality for you to study. So these things come before any philosophic inquiry, so I can't say as a philosopher that climate change is right or wrong. It is properly the study of scientists in that field. But what I can say is that those scientists do not have a monopoly on truth because they're scientists. They have to be beholden to the same objective principles of evidence that every other person is in any other field. So, as someone who is, skeptical of the warming hypothesis and its proponents, this is the first point I want to raise, is that someone who goes around saying, well, if you don't believe in climate change, you're a denier. What they're doing is basically saying that you're not buying into what the authority has to say on this, and so therefore you're wrong. It's an argument from authority, and it's false. You shouldn't be taken in by it. Even smart people are taken in by it. And people read this in the papers all the time. 99% of climate scientists say that it's happening. Well, for one thing, that statistic is bunk, and I can explain why that is in a second. Basically, so the 99% figure actually comes from a study where they analyzed were papers, and one scientist can author many papers, some scientists can author none in a certain frame of time. But what they did was they surveyed a whole bunch of papers, and even papers that were tangentially related to climate science, and then basically classified them as either pro or anti-warming. And how they did this, there's a whole paper methodology they wrote about this, and it's pretty suspect. I mean, even if the person raised the issue and didn't really say one way or the other explicitly they believed it, that was counted as a pro-warming paper. So the 99% statistic is bunk. But even if it weren't, even if it were true that 99% of scientists believed it, that wouldn't necessarily make it true. So that's the first thing, is authority does not carry its weight here. So now let's ask, well, is it actually happening? What does the science say? Now, I'm not an expert, as I said, but I am smart enough to read papers on it and the methodology, and basically read what the scientists are saying and how they summarize it in the press. And as far as I can tell, this field is a very young field. Climate is a huge dynamic system. It encompasses fluid dynamics, it encompasses chemistry, it includes biological systems and processes. It involves astronomical bodies, like you've got the sun emitting radiation to Earth, you've got the moon controlling the tides, you've got the Earth spinning on its axis, like what effect does that have? And I mean, even the composition of the oceans, plate tectonics, it's a geological issue, right? How much heat can the oceans absorb? How much CO2 can they absorb? These are all things that are, I think, largely not understood. And the field, as far as I can see, is mostly dominated by computer models. Models that make predictions about the future temperature increase of the planet. And these computer models, there's a variety of them, first of all. And second of all, they've been used for the last 30 years. And they haven't really managed to make accurate predictions. In fact, none of them have. They've made predictions that have been wildly exaggerated. In fact, the IPCC, which is the UN body on climate change, in like 2013, I think, had to come out and say, well, their prediction for warming was actually they had exaggerated. They had overestimated the warming by a huge factor. And this is not just true of global warming, the temperature. It's also true of things like sea level rise. In the papers I've read, and I'm going to provide multiple links to all the things that I read and where I got my facts for this video. But as far as I can tell, there are a range of predictions for where the sea level is supposed to rise. So it's a matter of fact, the sea level has risen basically almost continuously because the temperature has increased almost continuously. For the last, 150 to 200 years, we've seen a temperature increase of about 1 degree Fahrenheit per century. And what they're expecting is that by the year 2100, the temperature will have increased by over 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And their concern is that the sea level will rise. Now, what's the level of sea level increase that they're expecting? Some computer models put it as low as 4 inches. Others put it as high as 23 feet. I'm not even kidding. And some even go in the middle, 6 feet, 8 inches, 12 inches. I mean, the range of predictions and the fact that these models haven't really accurately predicted the temperature increases leads me to believe that this is not to be trusted to the point that a lot of people are willing to, which is to enact all kinds of legislation and essentially expect a doomsday scenario. So my view, I think there's evidence to suggest that the temperature has warmed, so I'm not a denier in that sense, By the way, the word denier kind of reminds me of when people in the old days used to call someone out as a heretic, or a blasphemer. Denier is not the language of science. That's the language of religion. The idea is either your views are consistent with the evidence or they're not. Now, again, the evidence has to be put in context and the evidence has to be sufficient to explain what's going on. You can't just take one study and then say that proves it, or even a small collection of studies and say that proves it. What you have to do is look at the full picture. And my understanding is that as far as the warming advocates go, many of their statistics fall shy. I mean, there's a famous graph, the hockey stick graph, right, which basically shows the temperature flat and then basically steeply increasing around 1850, 1870. And that's supposed to be heralded as evidence that the planet is warming due to human created CO2. The problem with that graph, of course, is that it didn't go far enough back in the history to actually account for the medieval period when there was a warming era that would have made the graph bimodal. I mean, it was so warm at the time in the medieval period that it looked almost, you would have had this, you would have gone down, you would have a hockey stick at the other end. So it wouldn't have looked as dramatic, and it wouldn't have been as conclusive, because it's actually a partial truth. It's not the full picture. Another example of the warmists, not giving the full picture is the idea of, well, CO2 is viewed as this greenhouse gas that's raising the temperatures. But if you look at the numbers, if you look at the history, the actual temperature increases actually precede the CO2 increases. So in other words, you have higher temperatures occurring before you have a measurable increase in CO2. So there's even a question of the causality there. Is it true that maybe the CO2 is increasing the warming? That could be. But it's also possible that other factors have led to an increased temperature. That has led to more life being viable on the planet, and that has in turn led to more CO2. So as far as that goes, there's an issue there of cause and effect, whether one causes the other, whether it's a feedback loop, and so on. It could be that there are other factors that we haven't accounted for. And a couple other examples of things that they don't account for. I mean, solar activity is something that I think is not well understood in its impact on the climate. The ability for the ocean to retain CO2, to act as a sink for CO2, as they say, is also not fully understood. And, as I said, they've already made faulty predictions. I mean, the whole idea that, human activity is causing the temperature to rise also doesn't take into account that there were periods in the historical past where we know there were higher concentrations of CO2. I think there was a period, don't quote me on this, one of the papers that I cite will write the number down. I can't remember the figure at the moment, but we're talking several million years ago. It's estimated that there was more than 10 times the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere as we have today. And yet the period that we're talking about was an ice age. I mean, the planet was blanketed in ice. So it's not like there's a one-to-one correlation there or a one-to-one correspondence. It's not that higher CO2 always leads to higher temperatures. That's a counterexample. So, again, we have to be objective and look at the facts, but you have to make sure you're not cherry-picking the facts. So that's where it leads me to the next topic here. So as far as I'm concerned, I think the first point they raise, that this is happening and that it's a scientific fact, that can at least be challenged. I don't deny it, because I think that there is warming. But I also think that the idea, the hostility to people who challenge it, should not be countenanced. I think people should be rejecting that kind of priestly way that they treat science, as this sort of enclave of specialists who know everything, and then they have to tell the public, and then you're just supposed to swallow it. That's not how science works. So I think it's possibly incorrect that it's happening, but due to human-made activity, predominantly done by human-made activity. But let's say it is. The other issue that I would raise is that, well, it's not even clear that it's a bad thing. More CO2 in the atmosphere means more plants. Plants actually feed on CO2. It's one of the things they use to perform photosynthesis. So having more CO2 in the atmosphere actually stimulates plant growth and leads to better crop yields. Conversely, it's also true that if areas that were previously icy melt, that land now becomes habitable and possibly, arable for humans. You can possibly live there and plant crops. So even though you may lose some island property or some coast property, that may free up property elsewhere, land elsewhere. So it's not clear that it's going to, end in a net loss of land. Finally, it's also true that if you're looking at climate-related deaths, more people die of cold than they do of heat. I mean, this is very true of places like the Ukraine, areas where it's very cold. People die because the crops fail. They die of hypothermia. They freeze to death. And in tropical climates, you have heat stroke, and, the coastal areas have hurricanes and stuff like that. But for the most part, people live longer lives. It's easier to survive in a warm climate. In fact, it's true of humans. We don't have fur. We don't have feathers. It's really difficult for us to survive in cold climates without clothing. But in hot climates, we do just fine. So, And I mean, most Americans, it's true, actually go to the Sun Belt. They've been fleeing the Sun Belt. There's a reason when people get older, they go to Florida and not to Maine or to, New Hampshire. It's colder up there. It's harder to survive. It's harder to get to shovel snow. You have to basically make sure you have enough food, and it's not easy. So it's not clear that so it could be happening. I won't deny off the bat that it is, but if it is, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And that leaves me to the third question is, what do we do about it if it is a bad thing? Now, this is a whole new range of issues, and this is not a scientific issue per se. This is actually an ethical, economic, political, and philosophic issue. Now, I would argue that even if it were a bad thing, we're not going to solve it by asking people to sacrifice. You're not going to solve it by taxing carbon, by taxing fuel emissions, by making people live worse lives, by having the government grow to a point where people's liberty is infringed. Because, as I made the point on this show before, science is based on evidence and reason. And reason is man's means of knowing reality, and it can only function without force. Force destroys reason. Force is anti-mind. So you can't expect a solution to be crafted by intelligent people if you suppress the intellect, and you do that with government action, with force. Remember, every government law is force. It's the use of a gun, basically. So, if there's a problem, the best thing you can do is free people up to solve it. I would say if you want to solve global warming, if you think it's a problem, first of all, if you think it's happening, you think it's a problem, the best thing you can do is push for more capitalism, push for freedom, push for individual rights, liberate the geniuses of the world. We want geniuses not just in North America and Europe. We want geniuses in Africa. We want geniuses in Australia and in South America. We want geniuses in Asia. We want all the population of this planet to be free so they can think, so they can actually come up with better ideas and maybe come up with a scientific solution to this problem if it exists. So you're not going to solve this problem by curtailing rights. You're only going to solve it by giving out more rights. And by that I mean individual rights, which is freedom from the government and freedom from coercion, freedom from force. So that, I think, is my view of global warming in a nutshell. But before I leave this video and this topic, the last thing I want to talk about is the motive of the global warming crew. And this is, again, not all of them, not everybody. I mean, you at home may believe in global warming. You may be convinced that it's a problem and that we need to do something about it. But I'm not going to necessarily say you're in this group. But I will say the leading thought leaders of this movement are of the same ilk as the general environmentalist movement. Now, I've made some remarks about the environmentalists on this show before, but I'm going to do again now, and I'm going to give you a little bit more detail as to why. So, environmentalism, in my view, and again, if you're an environmentalist, I kind of do want to insult you a little bit because I think it's pretty terrible. But if you're not, and you think you might be an environmentalist, I want to clear the air here. I think environmentalism is one of the most, if not the most, evil ideologies there are in existence today. It has a reputation as being basically a crusade against pollution, like a global cleanup crew, but that's not what environmentalism is about. Environmentalism is the view that nature, the environment, has a higher priority or precedence to man, and that man is essentially a plague, a virus, a cancer, an evil agent that is disrupting nature. That nature should be left alone, that every time humans go and they either drill for oil, or they burn fuel, or they make plastic, or they cut down trees, whatever it is, anytime a single species dies out or goes extinct because of actions that man has done to promote his life, that's bad. For environmentalists, humanity is a plague, and our means of survival on this planet, which is taking the natural resources of the planet, rearranging them for our benefit, and then basically putting those to use, is an original sin of sorts. So environmentalism is anti-human. And it's anti-human to the point where they call for sacrifice across the board, but they will especially target those things that we need the most to survive. So this is the reason why we have people like Macron putting on a fuel tax. It's not enough. I mean, notice France is one of the greenest countries in Europe in terms of emissions. They're the ones who basically were hosting the Paris Treaty. They are the ones who brag about being internationally minded and not wanting to despoil the earth. They are supposed to be very environmentally conscious, and yet that's not enough. You know, gasoline had already cost something like $7 a gallon in France before this tax, and they wanted to raise it even higher. That just shows you, what do they think about the average men and women who have to buy fuel for their families, whether that's to power their cars to go to work, to bring their kids to school, let alone to operate things like MRI machines or EKGs, machines to deal with people in medical emergencies. What about ambulances? What about just people who want to live a better life? People who grow up in the slums and basically want to buy a big house, which uses more energy, or someone who wants to make a career on the internet and work from home, so they need better internet connections, they need more electricity to power their home. You know, these things are all at odds with the environmentalist credo of leave nature untouched. And so when I look at an environmentalist, I see somebody who, you know, you could say about the Marxists, the feminists, the multiculturalists, a lot of the other collectivists on the left who basically despise individualism and want to initiate a world of state control. You could say that in a sense they have some human beneficiary in mind. Like the Marxists, they do it for the workers, supposedly, right? The feminists do it for women. The multiculturalists do it for the have-nots in the third world. But environmentalism is unique. It's a movement that doesn't have a human beneficiary. The beneficiary is wildlife. The beneficiary is rivers. The beneficiary is inanimate matter. It's basically something that isn't even living in many cases. And so, in my view, it's a uniquely evil ideology for that reason, because in my view, evil means going against the standard of man's life. It's basically doing something to make it impossible to live a human existence. And that's what environmentalists advocate for. So, you know, when I hear about global warming, there are a great number of people who are moderates. They don't really think that much. They have a great respect for science. And this is one of the most dangerous parts, by the way, of the environmentalist movement, is they've hijacked science. They think that they're scientific. And, you know, maybe they do in some twisted way think they are, but other people think they're scientific. And so they claim to speak for science when in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. They don't believe in objectivity. Many of them actually will throw aside viable solutions to their so-called environmental problems if it means they can still attack capitalism in other ways. That's what they want to do, is they want to destroy human, the human way of living. In their view, it'd be better if we all lived in caves, because then we would have a low, what they call a carbon footprint or an ecological footprint, right? Well, I'll tell you something. Your footprint will only go away when you're dead. Okay? If you want to make your footprint go to nothing or go as little as possible, kill yourself, because that's what it will take. As you're kicking, you're going to need to manipulate the resources on Earth to survive. That's how humans survive. That's how we are different from other animals. We have a mind. We can basically think abstractly and long term. We think in principles. We have a science that we have developed. And so we can basically plan long range, and we have the capacity to take our environment and change it to modify it to suit our needs. So other animals adapt themselves to their environment. We adapt our environment to us. That's what makes us different. And so environmentalists are against the very thing that makes us what we are. They're against the very thing that makes us human. So, you know, when we talk about the climate change movement as such, I look at it as an outgrowth of environmentalism. I think about all the other environmentalist projects that have come and gone over the years, whether it's people in the 70s saying we're going to have overpopulation, whether it's people who are trying to ban DDT because they claimed that it hurt bird eggs when there was no evidence for that. Millions of people died of malaria because of that. Whether it's the people who are, up in arms against, pesticides like LR and other things of that sort. There's lots of literature on ecological and environmentalist scares that never actually amounted to more than a hill of beans. And yet things got banned, industries went bankrupt, people lost money, and people lost their livelihood and even their standard of living over possibilities, often not even backed by any kind of evidence or any kind of science. So, and at the end of the video, which I'm almost done, I'll give you some reading that you can learn about all these things and maybe get a little bit of perspective on why I think the way I do. So one last thing on the climate change issue, and I want to bring it back to France real quick. So another thing about France that's interesting in this connection is that France has over 70% of their power taken care of by not carbon-based fossil fuels, but, you guessed it, nuclear power. Nuclear power is the elephant in the room that makes you know that the environmentalists do not care about humans. Because nuclear power is very safe, it has very few byproducts, it doesn't emit any carbon into the atmosphere, and in fact, there's have been almost no fatalities due to nuclear power in the West. They had Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, which was, in the early phases of development of nuclear power, but since then, it's gotten a lot more sophisticated. One thing that's kind of interesting, and in one of the books I'll recommend, the author goes into this, when nuclear power first came on the scene, it was basically in the form of atom bombs. It was mostly for the military to use in wartime. This was in the 1940s, right? The Manhattan Project, World War II. We didn't really worry too much about managing the waste materials or how to make generators that would basically make nuclear power have a low density but have it really widespread. This is something that only came about later in the 60s and the 70s. And now they've gotten into a science. In the United States, 20% of our power is taken care of by nuclear power. And yet they don't push for more nuclear power. In fact, they fight it tooth and nail, the environmentalists do, even though it solves all their problems. Why? I mean, think about that for a second. France, which is a first world country in Europe, 70% of their power, 70% taken care of by nuclear power. Are they irradiated? Are they dying of cancer at higher rates than we are? Are they, are they getting meltdowns every week, every month, or even every year, every decade? No, they aren't. It's very safe, it's very efficient, and it doesn't have the same byproducts that people worry about. So the fact that they don't advocate for it tells me that they don't really care that much about energy. They don't care about energy, and that means they don't care about human well-being. They care about nature, they care about rivers, they care about the rocks, they care about inanimate things. Now, in this same connection, of course, nuclear power is kind of the unsung hero and underutilized source. The sources that the environmentalists push for, like solar and wind, are no good. And it's not because the big corporations are in it and they want to bankrupt these small players who are trying to make, new power sources that are really good, but they just don't have a chance. They've had their chance and they've failed. The reason solar power and wind fail, there's two reasons. Number one, it's unreliable. Okay, solar power can only come out or get collected when the sun is shining, which isn't all the time. If you think about it, during the winter, it doesn't shine even half the day. And even in the summer, to collect that heat, you would need to basically make sure that you have your mirrors, your lenses, which have your solar cells, configured to always face the sun. I mean, that's a complex engineering task. The second reason, aside from the unreliability, is the fact that it's diffuse. It's too diffuse. So solar power, to really absorb it, to really make an impact and get a lot of it, you need to cover a huge acreage. You need to have miles and miles of solar panels that will collect the sun over a larger area, because we can't make the sun shine longer or brighter. That's beyond our ability. But what we can do is put more and more mirrors and more solar cells around and actually capture more sunlight by covering more area. And that's why you see when they make these solar powered farms, they require so much space for the solar panels. But that isn't costless either. I mean, you have to make sure all those mirrors are cleaned. Who cleans those? Those are humans spraying chemicals to clean, the mirrors. Imagine thousands of mirrors cleaned every day. That's no small task. Now, not to mention the fact that the cells themselves, the photovoltaic cells, are actually products of industry. They're based on plastics that are, of course, byproducts of fossil fuels. Plastic is a byproduct of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a wonderful technology, and in fact, they've enabled us to live wonderful lives. They've pulled us out of the jungles and into first world wealth and longer lives. So, in a way, green energy, solar and wind, is parasitic on fossil fuels and other kinds of fuels. So, anyway, this video is going on long, and I could say a lot more about this subject, but I'm going to leave it for now, and I'm going to actually leave you with a couple of things to read. So, and I'm going to write the names of all the books below, but one book I would recommend is The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels by Alex Epstein. So Alex Epstein is an objectivist. Moral Case for Fossil Fuels is a book that basically analyzes the environmentalist movement, climate change, energy generally, and explains not only what the facts are and the current state of the science, but it also provides a philosophic view and argument into why the environmentalist movement is evil and why fossil fuels have been a boon to mankind and why we should have more of them, not less of them. So he argues the same way I do, that essentially humans survive by taking reality and modifying it, manipulating it to suit our lifestyle, to suit our needs, and that's moral, and to oppose that is immoral. So, great read. Maybe I'm not doing it justice because I'm kind of rifling through it, but it's a good book. So, Moral Case for Fossil Fuels by Alex Epstein. Another book by a non-objectivist, by an interesting woman, is Trashing the Planet. And you can also read Environmental Overkill. 2 books by the same author. Her name is Dixie Lee Ray. D-I-X-I-E, Lee, L-E-E, Ray. She's interesting. She was a Democrat. She was a marine biologist who later became the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then she served as the governor of Washington State. So this woman was kind of all over the map. And she was a huge critic of environmentalism. And her book, Trashing the Planet, I tell you something. It was written in the 1990s, so it's a little out of date, but boy, does it show you the dishonesty and the state of the science at that time. And it shows you how not much has really changed. I mean, back then, the big buzzwords were acid rain, ozone depletion, CFCs in the atmosphere, dioxin, ALAR. This was like in the pre-GMO stage. Before GMOs really got started, the environmentalists made their living going around trying to get pesticides banned, DDT, and so on. This book is chock full of facts. This woman knows her stuff. I mean, it's funny. She was a huge proponent for nuclear power, and she points out that you absorb more radiation in your home if you live in one of these tightly confined, energy-saving homes from radon gas than you do from nuclear power plants. I mean, the basic argument is that radon is naturally occurring. It's an inert, noble gas, but what happens is that it creeps up into your home through your foundations, and then basically it undergoes radioactivity, and it decomposes into what are called radon daughters. Things like lead, potassium, things that are actually radioactive and harmful to you. So, she has so many facts in this book. It's a really great read, and she's a character. I mean, she has an excellent metaphor or analogy that I wanted to share with you. Actually, it relates to solar power. So she gives the analogy of solar power is kind of like, it's a very inefficient kind of fuel. She says, to see why it's inefficient, why it doesn't work, let's talk about something else. Suppose you have a load of stone to carry, and you have a choice. You can either have an elephant do it, or you can have 2 million fleas do it. Now, she argues that those two groups, the elephant and the 2 million fleas, have what is called the same biomass. So if you take all their biological matter and you put it into one spot and measure it, the elephant has the same amount of biomass as 2 million fleas. So they have, in a sense, the same motive power, behind them. But the elephant, it's one organism to direct. If you can get the elephant to move, you're going to move the load. 2 million fleas. How are you going to get 2 million fleas to all go in the same direction? How are you going to get them all to be harnessed up to the same load? It's almost impossible to imagine, but that's, in a sense, physically what people who advocate for solar power replacing every kind of energy are arguing for. They're saying, we have an elephant that lifts loads, let's replace it with 2 million fleas. How are we going to get them all to jump in the same direction? Somehow. That's what it comes down to. So, book is great. So, Environmental Overkill, Trashing the Planet. Another book that summarizes these other 3 books in some ways is The Politically Incorrect Guide to Global Warming and Environmentalism. Now, this book, I will argue and admit, is a little more provocative than the other two authors, but it's a good compendium of quotes, statistics, facts about the environmentalist movement. And it really shows you their true nature, their true philosophic agenda, and where they are ethically and morally. So that's another one I would recommend you read. Now, parting thoughts on environmentalism. I doubt this will be the last time that I talk about it on this show. But the last thing I want to say is another point that Alex Epstein makes in his book. And I think this is an important point to make. And I kind of said it earlier too, but I kind of want to reiterate it in a different formulation. We talked about a lot here. We talked about evidence. We talked about what it means to be a scientific authority and whether you can trust them or not. But let's go back to the issue of humans and how they survive. See, it's kind of a fact or factoid. It's something that people think that, well, nature is safe and we pollute it or make it unsafe with our chemicals and our manufacturing and our capitalism and all the other exploitive things that we do, right? Well, that's not true. Nature doesn't give us a clean, healthy place to live and then we ruin it. Rather, nature gives us a dangerous, hostile place to live and we make it habitable. Water isn't naturally clean. Food isn't naturally pasteurized. Things are not artificially cleaned, decontaminated. Penicillin doesn't exist just naturally without us making it. Plastics don't exist naturally without us making it. Machines, computers, glasses, medicines, clothing. These things don't exist naturally. If we were to take anybody in this country or in this world today and just drop them naked with no man-made artifacts into the jungle somewhere, they would survive less than a day. They'd probably survive less than an hour, most of them. And that's not a bad thing. What that means is that humans, that's our niche. That's how we survive. It's intelligence. We only survive because we have a mind capable of reason, capable of taking reality and manipulating it to suit our needs. We don't have claws, we don't have wings, we can't swim that fast, we can't run that fast. We're kind of weak physically. Where we shine is our mind. And those who are arguing that we need to cut back on energy, we need to roll back our machine civilization, we need to roll back our usage and exploitation of the earth, these people are trying to say no to the mind. They're saying no to the human means of survival. And I think that is really despicable and something that needs to be fought tooth and nail. So that's one of the reasons I do this show. Anyway, I'm glad I got to do this episode. It's been a while. I hope everyone has a good rest of your week. If I don't see you before the holidays, I hope I will do another video before Christmas. But if I don't, have a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Talk to you later. Bye.